Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Gooey's Dungeon Dive, the show where I rank all of the dungeons in the Legend of Zelda series. And as always, for this season, I am joined by my special Wind Waker correspondent, Corey Richmond.
It's me, Corio.
We find ourselves today in our first full dungeon in the Wind Waker. It's taken long enough, but here we are at Roost Cavern. And as mentioned in the last episode, we are sort of following after Medley into the dungeon to investigate this mystery of what's going on with the Great Valoo, why is he so upset, and we're trying to prove our courage to the Rito people, in particular, the young Prince Kamali, so we can get that Din's Pearl that he's hanging on to. This dungeon, it fits very well, I think, into the world of the Wind Waker. The island itself, it appears to be this, big volcano, and the dungeon itself has us traversing inside, up and along the outside, and it's sort of reminiscent to me of the Fire Temple. The navigation was going up and down these two volcanoes, and it was pretty straightforward, but it did have that momentum, that feeling of traveling up to the top of a volcano. Drawing on other past elements too, I would say the theme for the dungeon sounds very similar to like Dodongo's Cavern. You have kind of the spooky reptilian feel to it, which maybe makes a little less sense here than Dodongo's Cavern, but I get the comparison they're going for.
I think it's done very well. I also don't think it's anything super spectacularly groundbreaking or anything like that. We've seen volcanic areas before. We've seen plenty of fire-inspired areas before. Thematically, what I think is really strong about this dungeon is the actual volcano ascent portion, which I'm sure we'll get to, but kind of the fact that you're going inside and outside and you're walking over bridges that are hanging over lava pits and stuff like that. I think it's done very well. That's something that is such a novel concept that has been tossed into a few dungeons in the series so far. You're ascending a volcano. It makes sense that you go from cavern to outside, climb up the side, go back in, come back out. But on top of that, I actually also appreciate how it kind of changes the gameplay a little bit when you get outside, because it comes less about puzzling and fighting enemies and more about precarious jumps and finding your way across a bridge and avoiding the lava plume when you climb up the ladder. And then that last part where you get the key from the Kargarok, I think that's really cool too.
There's kind of one other sort of theme, I feel like, or like a sort of vibe it's going for, and it ties really into the story of the game, which is, although, this was previously an area that was like safely traversed by the Rito, so they go up and meet with Valoo, it's now taken over by Ganondorf's men, so they have all these guards keeping the dungeon kind of on lockdown. And this creates, for me, I think, one of the most fun gameplay elements, which is like more use of the sticks and their weapons. We had a little bit of that with the guards in Forsaken Fortress, but it's stepped up a bit here. You've got using the sticks to light torches, which is classic, but the gameplay expands from there. There's like passages that are walled up. Some of them, they're easily broken through with your sword, but others require like a little bit extra oomph, I guess, to break them. So you'll either need like a heavier weapon from a bokoblin or, hitting it with a lit torch.
Something that I noticed more so about this dungeon than I have on previous playthroughs is that just kind of keeping my eye out for teaching the player and things that are meant to intentionally teach the player things. This dungeon is chock full of presenting you subtly with some information, teaching you a mechanic. Like in the second room of the whole dungeon, you have to fight some bokoblins and you need a key to get to the next room, and they have wooden torches that are lit on fire, right? And there's two unlit torches, and you think, oh, well, from Forsaken Fortress, I know I can pick up their weapons, so why don't I go over and try and light that torch myself with their weapon? And it's like subtly teaching you the mechanics of fire in this game and how that's going to work. Just in this dungeon alone, it's compounding on that with, okay, I can burn these wooden blocked doors down. And now, okay, there's a wooden blocked door I can burn down, but it's across a gap. So what if I throw it across? Will it still work? And I think it's incredibly clever how they're teaching you not only how to solve puzzles in a dungeon space, but also just how the mechanics of this game work.
The best example of like what I think Wind Waker does really well, which is the navigation in this dungeon, for example, is I think very straightforward, but compared to like the Fire Temple, for example, I think it does a better job of presenting like the individual room-to-room experience, because it has more clever puzzles, more fun kind of challenges, stuff like that, that's bringing you through the dungeon. Especially, I think, those little unique, memorable puzzles that build off of each other. And the weapons, the one you gave, that's the best example. But this dungeon has a few other things going on.
Honestly, all of the puzzles in this dungeon I really like. In essence, they're not super difficult puzzles, but I just really love the way that this dungeon is constantly teaching you, presenting you with new information. Like, for example, with the water jugs. You walk into one room, and there's a gap of lava that you can't jump across, and you see just a bunch of these jugs, right, that you haven't seen before. So you throw them around, and you see that they're filled with water, and then eventually you're going to stumble upon the fact that you throw it into the lava pit, it's going to create a platform, which, first of all, I think is a brilliant just game mechanic in itself, the way that water dynamically reacts to the lava. But then once you know that, the dungeon treats that as knowledge that you have and presents you with a slightly upped difficulty puzzle later on. Like, for example, you have a lava geyser shooting up, and you need to throw a pot onto that to make a platform to raise you up to the next level. There are a few things with bombs. There's one, when you're on the first floor, it takes you in a big loop, and then you come around, and you get to a spot where there's a few rocks, there's a few pots, and then there's a big rock blocking your way that you know from trying to get into Dragon Roost in the first place. Oh, I can blow this up with a bomb. And then you see that there are bomb flowers around, but they're not in a spot where you can pick them up. They're hanging on the wall. You would naturally think, all right, what do I have at my disposal? There's rocks and pots. You pick up one of those, either of them, and you need to throw it and hit the bomb to blow up a chain of bombs to blow up a rock. It's puzzles like that that make me think, like, this game was ahead of its time. It almost reminds me of a Breath of the Wild type thing, where it's like a chain of events caused by the game mechanics and the physics of the game, and it's just, in prior games, those two things might be programmed to react completely differently on their own, but when you combine rock plus bomb, it happens to create an explosion, which blows up the next bomb, which blows up the rock. And I just think that's really cool.
You can cut the ropes on the bridges, or you could also burn them. It feels dynamic, like part of the world, you know? It doesn't just feel like, bring this item to this spot. There's one other element about the whole theme that I was talking about of, like, the guards being there. I think it might get repetitive later on, just having, like, those kind of Ganon's minions there. I do like that, and it works really well with the story that we're being led to this dungeon to help them. Once you do make this ascent to the top of the mountain, you do run into Medley, who's imprisoned up there. And you have kind of this fun little part where you have like a mini battle arena against some bokoblins and some moblins and set her free. You can pick up their different weapons and knock them around. It's nothing difficult or anything, but it is just kind of a cool set piece.
You know, the whole concept of this area in the world of the Wind Waker is that Rito that come of age need to find their way up the volcano without their wings, so that they can get their wings when they reach Valoo. So I think it's really fitting that this dungeon might not be the most navigationally complex, but it really does feel like a challenge to whoever is going room to room and testing themselves to see if they can get to the top. And I think that especially for us comes true when we get to the top and we have this nice moment, and then we end up freeing Medley and getting the dungeon item.
And so what do you think about the item, the grappling hook?
I don't know what can be said about it. I love the grappling hook. And I think that the way that it's used right when you get it, it's one of those immediate satisfaction dungeon items. It kind of reminds me almost like Rock's Feather in Tail Cave in Link's Awakening, because that's one where you kind of go down a path and you get to an end point and then you get the item. And then on your way back, there are several places, several pits and several little holes where you can be like, I can use it here, I can get this item in the air here, I can use it here, and it makes your traversal back that much easier. And in this, on your way up, staircases fall down, and then when you exit, you swing on a bunch of posts using the grappling hook down multiple levels, kind of back towards where you came from. And I think it feels so satisfying to use it immediately and have that understanding of, all right, that's how this works. And also you can connect the dots because it's like, I've been seeing these posts all over the place. So now it's just free reign when I see one of those guys.
I do love just the feeling of using the grappling hook is really fun, and swinging and kind of changing the direction of your swing and stuff like that. It's, I guess, what the ropes was teaching us. I did like, you go back down and then it's now like you can swing to the dungeon boss room, but you need the key and you got to backtrack to get that. And there's sort of a path that it leads you onto that. I feel like they could have done a little bit more. Like there's one area where there's like a little bit of an optional backtracking to get some C chart or something like that. I think maybe if that was like required or something, because otherwise it is kind of like you just go on another long path to get the key to the boss room. And it's a fun path, don't get me wrong, but I feel like Link's Awakening, I think, is a good example where it's like you get the item and now there's like, you know, a small key you can get, a boss key you can get, and the path to the boss room is blocked by the small key. Something minor like that. I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it, but I did feel like once I got that item, I was sort of just being now led to the next thing.
It becomes almost more of like a fun little platforming challenge rather than a puzzle when you see one of those. I don't think you really get a ton of different types of grappling hook puzzles in this.
I think that's kind of how these go a lot of the times in the games previous to this. I think more as Zelda games go on, it goes on to you get the item and then it's like a big spectacular. But I actually kind of think of like you don't usually get into like the real fun stuff to do with the item until like the next dungeon, you know?
If Dragon Roost Cavern was the 5th dungeon of the game, I think we might have seen more of like you get the grappling hook and then it completely changes the way that you can navigate the dungeon. Whereas since this is still an intro dungeon, it's like, okay, you have this and now here's an additional element to your traversal of the rest of the dungeon. It's not really pushing the boundaries of like, whoa, this dungeon is crazy now.
Yeah, and I don't think I needed that. I was just thinking like, yeah, maybe they could have just stepped it up a little bit. But you know what? That wasn't a big knock for me, and neither was the next thing I'm going to say. This is one of my biggest pet peeves, and I've complained about it in other Zelda games, but the small key situation of this dungeon does kind of bug me. Pretty much all the locked doors in the dungeon, they're opened by keys that you get in the same room. I think at that point, why even bother with keys? Why not like a switch? I kind of understand the concept of maybe introducing the idea of small keys, or like, you know, the child dungeons in Ocarina of Time didn't even have them, but there's also like more dungeons in that game, and it's kind of a buzzkill to me to like get a key and like there's the door. That's why, and I think my fix is the perfect fix, because I think the natural progression here lines up where first key you get is in the same room in the beginning. Second key you get is in a different room, but the natural way it leads you is to the next room where you use it once you blow up that boulder. That's why I would make the third key that optional area you can go to with the grappling hook that's kind of out of the way, because then it gives you like one last little challenge.
I think this dungeon's probably not super concerned about navigationally challenging. I think there probably could have been some more. It's probably just not that concerned with it. I actually do appreciate a lot something that I wouldn't expect to see in a first dungeon, and I think you kind of touched on it a little bit. It's kind of right after you come back down from getting the grappling hook. Besides the passage you're talking about that you need to go through to get the boss key, I feel like you've explored most of the dungeon. Something that is brand new to this game that we haven't touched on yet is the warp pots that appear in several rooms throughout this dungeon, and it's 3 different warp pots, and if you've opened them all up at this point, I actually really appreciate that those warp pots make it pretty convenient. If you still have that thought in your mind, you can be like, oh, I can warp back to the second pot or to the first pot and then find my way over there, do that little puzzle, and then find my way back here, you know. I think that streamlines the backtracking pretty well.
And that just gives more credence to my opinion about how that should lead to a key. But,
yeah.
So all this dungeon diving eventually leads us to the creature disturbing the Great Valoo, Goma. And this is sort of a unique presentation of Goma. It's less like that kind of spider crab Goma. I guess it's got the claws, but it's more of a big centipede guy.
Yeah, I almost think it's almost more got some scorpion-like elements.
Still got the eye and the claws, which is pretty crucial to a Goma, I think.
I think they have become fond of big spider Goma. I appreciate that they're trying something different. I always like when they try and give a new take on a classic enemy. And I like that it plays into the mechanic of this boss fight, but the whole thing is that it has like a really hard exterior, really hard shell, and I think that's kind of cool.
So yeah, you can't just, hit Goma with your sword or the grappling hook. Only, by taking the grappling hook and pointing it at the tail of Valu, just sticking down into the dungeon, which is another, I like that added touch. And, you swing on that tail and it kind of causes part of the ceiling to shake loose and crash down onto Goma. It cracks her armor until it breaks. And then the second phase is kind of the classic. Hit the eye with the grappling hook, pull her close, hit her with the sword. It's kind of my description of a lot of elements of Wind Waker. Is like, yeah, it's not too tough, but it is like kind of big and grand and fun.
The biggest thing is that I love how cinematic it is. Like when you grab onto Valu, you get the little cutscene of him outside, like, whoa, like what's going on down there? Something this game does so well is like the direction. I'm talking in movie terms, but like the shot of Link swinging over Goma, who's like looking up and spewing fire, it's just very cool.
I guess the only knock I would say is that it is like, however many hours into the game, and feels like it's still like teaching you some of the basics, you know what I mean? Like Great Deku Tree gets some of this out of the way, I think early on. If you remove that context and you are just like, this is like the first real dungeon in the game, I think it is successful at doing that. So it's kind of, for me, I don't know how to feel about it in that regard,
That's something that kept coming to my mind, is how much it reminded me of ways of Great Deku Tree from Ocarina of Time. The way that it teaches you things that are then kind of twisted in a way and re-presented to you in another few rooms. It reminded me a lot of that cycle of learning, processing, utilizing. That is similar to what that was teaching, but put it into context. Great Deku Tree is like one of the first things you do in Ocarina of Time, whereas we're already a few hours into this game.
I think the game does push forward unique gameplay elements that are sort of introduced there in Ocarina of Time and kind of expanding it. And I think that's what eventually will get us to, stuff like Breath of the Wild, where you're kind of experimenting with different solutions and stuff like that.
Yeah, I do think that's also something that I can maybe forgive Dragon Roost Cavern for a little bit, is that there are a lot of game mechanics and physics at play here that maybe it has to teach a little bit more. It's not like it's retreading anything really that we've learned in the past few hours. It just keeps exponentially building on what we have learned, which I think is cool.
Yeah, I would just say it's more to do with the previous part of the game, but I think the way it thinks it needs to onboard you onto certain gameplay elements is sort of like, I get there's some people who maybe have never played it before, but I think it's still a little too make sure you can do this. This could have happened earlier in the game with a little bit less tutorial, and I think, I don't know. Leave a comment if you got stuck in Dragon Roost or like completely confused. But, I don't think that happens. After defeating Goma, we get the gratitude of Medley, the respect of Komali, and we get that Din's Pearl that we've been looking for. They hint towards that Wind Shrine that we mentioned in the previous episode, which, lets us kind of set off on our further adventures. But before we do that, we should rank this dungeon. And I think, kind of keeping in similar with the last two seasons, the first question I sort of have to ask you is, do you think Dragon Roost Cavern is better than the Forsaken Fortress? Just in this game alone, how are we doing?
Well, going in sequence of what we've experienced of Forsaken Fortress so far, I would say this is far and away much better than the first section of Forsaken Fortress that we have played through so far. I didn't have Forsaken Fortress very high. We talked about that. I don't think we've experienced enough of it where I could consider it much of a dungeon. And I think this is not only a full-blown dungeon feeling dungeon, but a rather successful one.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you there. I put it above it for sure. And we ranked this actually. You know, the context of our list is different, but we had Forsaken Fortress at the exact same spot on both our lists last time, which is pretty cool. But how much better do you think it is? Like, where'd you place it, and what was your thinking with that?
I ended up placing it significantly higher, and this kind of comes back to what I was thinking about a lot of the time while I was playing through. Is like, this reminds me so much of the cycle of teaching of the Great Deku Tree from Ocarina of Time. So what I ended up doing is slotting it right underneath inside the Great Deku Tree and right above Dodongo's Cavern. So right now it's sitting at number 24 on my list. It's definitely decisively in the upper half of my list, but it hasn't breached any of the, mind-blowing ones. I don't think this dungeon is particularly mind-blowing. I just think it's very succinct with what it's trying to do, which is be sort of an intro dungeon and teach you these mechanics and build on these mechanics. And I think, especially for a first-time player who isn't really concerned with the flow or the pacing of the game, I think this would be a very successful dungeon. And also, I think it's fitting that it slotted right below that and right above Dodongo's Cavern, because thematically it is also very similar to Dodongo's Cavern. It's sort of a volcanic, cavernous locale, and I think Dragon Roost Cavern definitely does it better than Dodongo's Cavern.
You know, one thing that I didn't mention, but it did kind of make me think of Dodongo's Cavern a lot, because you are kind of like circling back round into this one room, but this time you're climbing up. Like, they kind of combined it in the Fire Temple, and kind of stripped the Fire Temple down to the bare bones and combined it with the Dodongo's Cavern. But I think it's just way more successful, because one thing I kind of felt like a lot of the Ocarina of Time puzzles lived and died off their like big thematic puzzle for the dungeon, and you know how I kind of was about that one, whereas I feel like this is more about the individual puzzles and like building up on each other. So I thought it was better than both Dodongo's Cavern and Fire Temple, because it did a similar thing, but it was like way more fun. Like, I can't fully knock it that much for how like linear whatever I feel it is, because it is like just really fun, a really fun game from room to room. So it's not necessarily a big knock for me, Like I said, I think it's better than the Fire Temple. I sort of see what you're saying about the Great Deku Tree. In fact, I almost 100% agree. Other than it is like, it's sort of the second dungeon. It's sort of not. It's sort of the intro dungeon. That has more to do with the game, but I'm not like docking it huge for that, but that is kind of a sticking point for me. It's like, all right, but it is somewhere in this area. I think for me it's above Wing Dungeon for sure. I think what it's got to be for me is it's still hard. I think I'm gonna put it for me just below the Great Deku Tree, and I guess you won't push back on that too much, because you also have it just below on yours.
That's exactly where I have it, just a few spots higher.
Yeah, so we're still pretty lined up on this game, I think. And I think some people might be, because there were people sort of predicting we're gonna go into this game and I'm gonna be just super negative Nancy on the dungeons, you know what I mean? But one thing I think that's important is like it's a game that's trying to do something different, you know what I mean? It is going for sort of a different design philosophy, and while there are times that it kind of, I get caught on a little hitch, like I was mentioning earlier, the little thing I was griping about, I think it is very overall successful in the other things that it is trying to do. And so while it's, I'm not coming to every dungeon with like, it has to meet like these 3 sets of perfect criteria, you know what I mean? Would I have liked it more if it was a little different? Maybe, but I think overall just the experience of, especially those items, those are really clever, really fun puzzles. So it is a little bit like apples and oranges, or trying to compare like Mario to Tetris or something. Maybe a little less so here because there's a lot of similarities, but that's why I still feel very strongly about this dungeon, even though it's, you know, pretty early on in the game or pretty early on in like the complexity and stuff like that. But yeah, I actually think this is a lot of fun. It's not, you know, my favorite dungeon in the series, but I think actually when Mas and I ranked these, we did a video and I think I actually ranked this really high. So that is one thing I will say for people who are fans of the game is this might be like one of the higher dungeons in the game though. So we'll see what happens.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like I said, I've mentioned this before, but I kind of come into these with like I'm trying to give it the most good faith, like I'm trying to look for its best qualities. You know, what is there to love about this? So maybe I'll see something in the other dungeons that I hadn't before, but I do remember like being particularly high on like this and the next dungeon over even some of the fan favorites, but we'll see.
Something that I appreciate so much about this, not only the dungeons of this game, but this game in general, is how they treat video game levels as a real space. I think that's something that this game excels at greatly, and I think that is definitely something to pay attention to in all of the dungeons moving forward.
Oh, for sure. That'll for sure be a theme we keep hitting on. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into those. You know what? It's worth mentioning. You can use the grappling hook to take items from enemies. How about that?
That too.
We didn't even mention its key feature. But yeah, otherwise, I'm pretty excited to get into the rest and to, I don't know, explore more of this game. Now we're kind of at a point where it's going to be harder. I don't think we're going to be able to like say everything we did in the game, but we'll kind of give an overview of the section and, you know, how the game changes and stuff. But yeah, looking forward to talking more about that as we head towards the next dungeon.